Last time I promised I'd explain to you something I call 4BQ, and I'm going to do that soon. First, though, I need to tell you a story. Now, previously I told you that I started studying cult psychology when my two best friends joined a cult. I attended one of their open meetings in the living room of an old Victorian house way out in the country. That brief visit made it clear to me that this group was a cult. It wasn't clear to my two best friends. When they disappeared into that cult, the pain of losing them sent me on a quest. I had to understand what was going on in their minds. What happened that caused them to buy into the empty promises of this cult? And, just importantly, how come I didn't buy in? Now, it took about 3 years before I began to find any answers. The first clue I found in a book called The True Believer by Eric Hoffer. It was a study of the common characteristics of mass movements during the 20th century. In it, he showed that the easiest recruits for communism were people who had been committed fascists. The easiest recruits for radical religions were people who had been committed atheists. What? Fascists switching to communism at the drop of a hat? Atheists becoming radical fundamentalists without missing a beat? What's going on here? As strange as it may seem, there are sound psychological reasons for these apparently nonsensical changes of direction. So what does this have to do with 4BQ? See, every human being comes into this world with a set of common needs. You've got needs for air, food, water, shelter, and clothing. And in addition to those physical needs, you have the gnawing, aching psychological need of 4BQ. So what is 4BQ? It's the 4 big questions. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? And the biggest of all, who am I? Every one of us, every human being requires answers to these questions. And listen, you cannot live without answers to those questions. You will find answers to the 4 big questions. They may not be good answers, but you will find answers of some kind. Why? Without answers, there's a vacuum in your life, and that vacuum sucks answers into it. It doesn't matter if the answers make any logical sense. And weirdly enough, there are sound cognitive reasons for that apparent contradiction. Daniel Kahneman is a psychologist and economist. He won a Nobel Prize for his work on behavioral economics. He studied the difference between the two sides of the brain, what he calls the fast brain and the slow brain. The slow brain is the rational, verbal, logical, mathematical part of our brain. The fast brain, on the other hand, is the intuitive part. And the intuitive part is the one that's in charge of answering the 4 big questions. Since answers to the 4BQ are absolutely essential to survival, it would make sense to think that our rational brain would be in charge of that. But it isn't. These needs are ancient, and the rational brain is a relatively recent development in our evolutionary history. The fast brain, the intuitive brain, has been around a lot longer. And that's the one that finds answers to the 4 big questions. The fast brain is intuitive. It doesn't do logic. It does pattern recognition. And pattern recognition, by definition, tends to be a little lower resolution than detailed logic. And for that reason, the fast brain uses heuristics, rules of thumb, that allow it to quickly assess a situation and pass a judgment. These heuristics are normally good enough. They may or may not be 100% accurate 100% of the time, but for most of life, these heuristics, these rules of thumb, they work well enough. It's a function of how our brain works. Now, I can go into the neurology of that another time, but for our purposes, it's because we've got this fast brain that we're susceptible to making really strange shifts to find answers to the 4 big questions. Now, remember, the 4 big questions are, where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? And who am I? Eric Hoffer illustrated this weird anomaly of our fast brain when he showed that people who'd been committed to one particular ideology could easily switch to the completely opposite ideology without any awareness of the incongruency of their change. They just switched. The reason they can do that is because of the heuristics that our fast brain uses. Finding answers to the 4 big questions is the job of the fast brain. It's about pattern recognition. It's not about detailed logical analysis. When people deeply involved in a highly politicized mass movement found that mass movement no longer fulfilling, they were left with a gaping psychological vacuum inside. The mass movement that had previously provided sufficient answers to their 4 big questions had suddenly failed them. When a completely opposite ideology came along, say fascism versus communism, and provided them answers to the 4BQ, they switched. Making the switch to an opposite ideology seems illogical to the logical brain, but to the fast brain, no problem. It works. Why? Because the new ideology provides good enough answers to the 4 big questions. Those 4 big questions are always in the mind of every human being all the time. And by the mind, I don't mean our conscious awareness. I mean that they lurk deep inside us, just below the level of our consciousness. We cannot live without answers to those questions. We don't live without answers. Without them, we are lost. People without answers usually either go mad or kill themselves. Now, next time, I'm going to explain the relationship between the 4 big questions and the golden age of advertising. They had answers to the 4BQ. Their answers, by the way, don't apply anymore. I'm Jack Heald. I ask the hard questions.